Hello, welcome back. We're going to spend some time talking about trade. As I told you earlier, trade is an essential part of a successful economy. Now, I pointed out that if you have full information and people are trading freely, that individuals are always better off than if they don't trade. And the same is true for countries. If countries trade between them, and that trade is freely traded back and forth, and there's full information, then both countries are better off. Now, today I'm going to show you, using graphs, how that works to help convince you that this is the case. Now, remember that if countries are both better off, that doesn't mean that all of the individuals in those countries are better off. In fact, chances are some of the individuals in both countries will be worse off. However, this is a way to increase productivity, increase wealth, and with that wealth comes the opportunity to help take care of people who aren't able to produce. To begin with, what I want to do is introduce you to the production possibility curve. And in this case, what we're going to do is we're going to create a very simple model, a country that consists of two people, and they only produce two products. They're both involved in the production of agriculture. And what we have is Frank the farmer. Now, Frank is our first player in this economy. And Frank, he creates meat, and he also grows potatoes. Now, he's not very good at this, but he does his best. And in a given 8-hour period, across a year, in a given 8-hour period, Frank can produce 1 ounce of meat per hour. It takes him 8 hours to generate 8 ounces, which is about half a pound of meat. On the other hand, Frank's very good at growing potatoes. He's a farmer. If he devotes those same 8 hours to growing potatoes, he can produce 32 ounces of potatoes. Now, it so happens Frank doesn't like to live on just potatoes or just meat. So he wants to produce a combination of those two. And in this case, he likes a 4-to-1 ratio. He likes 4 parts potatoes and 1 part meat. That means he's going to spend 4 hours growing potatoes so he can produce 16 ounces of potatoes. And the ratio then to meat would be another 4 hours, that's his 8 hours, another 4 hours managing his cattle or whatever, and that would produce 4 ounces of meat. So he gets 16 ounces of potatoes and 4 ounces of meat, as shown in the graph. Now, let's take a look at this graph a little closer. On the x-axis, we have the amount per hour in ounces of the potatoes. So this is going to reach a maximum at 32. Because that's the most he could produce. On the y-axis, we have the same thing, but for meat. Now, we know that he can only produce 1 ounce of meat per hour, and so the maximum value here is 8, and then beyond that he's not capable. So in other words, if he devotes 8 hours to producing meat, and only meat, then he would be up in the upper left-hand corner. If he'd spent those same 8 hours only growing potatoes, he'd be down in the bottom right-hand corner. So we can draw a line between those 2 points, and this is known as the production possibility frontier, the PPF, the production possibility frontier. It means he can't produce outside of that line. He can only produce inside that line. So the triangle is his production possibility, and then what we do is we put a mark on his preferences. So we're going to mark the 4 ounces of meat, the 16 ounces of potatoes, which is on the production possibility frontier, and he's going to try to produce that much of each so he can get exactly what he wants. So that's his world. Let me introduce you to Rosie the Rancher. Now, Rosie is very, very effective at what she does. She also raises cattle and grows potatoes. And what's interesting is that in any given 8 hours Rosie can produce 24 ounces of meat. It's a lot more meat. She's a rancher. She knows how to do this, right? On the other hand, she happens to have a green thumb and she can grow things very easily. And so if she devotes the same 8 hours to growing potatoes, she can grow 48 ounces of potatoes. So 48 ounces of potatoes, that's her maximum point on the x-axis. 24 ounces of meat, that's the highest point for meat, and it's on the y-axis. We connect the highest point on the y-axis with a line to the highest point on the x-axis, and that is Rosie the Rancher's production possibility frontier, PPF. And of course, she likes a 2-to-1 ratio. She likes more meat. So she'll eat 2 ounces of potatoes for every 1 ounce of meat. And we can mark that on her production possibility frontier, where she can maximize her utility by having 12 ounces of meat and 24 ounces of potatoes. Now, you might have noticed something. If we set these two graphs side by side, we can see that Rosie is better than Frank in every way. She can produce more meat per hour. She can produce more potatoes per hour. She simply has better capabilities than Frank does. Rosie has what we call an absolute advantage over Frank. It means she's just better in every way than Frank. Now the question is, should Frank give up and not produce anything? Because after all, he's not as good as Rosie. So maybe he should just sit at home and play video games while she does all the production. Well, of course, that's ridiculous, because if they both work, we can produce more together. But then the question becomes, should Frank and Rosie spend that same ratio of hours, 4 hours on one and 4 hours on the other? It makes sense to do that when you're producing what you want for yourself. But now, if we're trying to become more efficient as an economy, what makes sense? And so what we're looking for is something we call the comparative advantage. So the absolute advantage, let me give you a definition. The absolute advantage is where one party can produce more of every good with fewer resources. One party can produce every good with fewer resources. So think about this. Frank takes 4 hours to produce 8 ounces of meat. She takes 4 hours to produce 12 ounces of meat. He can produce 16 ounces of potatoes in 4 hours, and she can produce 24 ounces of potatoes in that same time. So what we would say is that Rosie has an absolute advantage over Frank, but in every case we will find that even the Franks of the world have a comparative advantage. So what is a comparative advantage? Let me give you a definition for that. A comparative advantage means that your opportunity cost is lower. What you have to give up is less than what the other person has to give up. Let's make an extreme example. Let's talk about Steph Curry, the point guard of the Warriors. Now, my wife and I raised our kids in Silicon Valley, and so it's kind of hard to let go of the team that we cheered for so many years. So we enjoyed that time there. The Warriors now, of course, fallen into a situation where they're losing almost every game because of injuries. But for a long time, the Warriors were winning all the world championships and everything, and it was great. So Steph Curry makes a lot of money, and he's famous, and he has a big house with a lot of lawn. So my question would be, should Steph Curry mow his own lawn? Should he mow his own lawn? Well, the first question would be, does he have an absolute advantage over the teenager down the street? In other words, he could have the teenager down the street mow his lawn, or he could mow his lawn. Who has the absolute advantage when it comes to mowing the lawn? Well, look, Steph is a very talented and very good athlete, and he's smart. And if he had the same tools, he could probably run faster back and forth across the lawn and mow the lawn in less time than the neighbor boy could. So he has an absolute advantage. And so then, does that mean that he should mow his own lawn? And the answer is no. Because the neighbor boy has the amazing comparative advantage here. In other words, if you look at the actual amount of resources being expended, Steph is better. He can do it in fewer hours, right? But if we look at the comparative advantage, meaning the opportunity cost, now all of a sudden the neighbor boy has the advantage. Why? What is his opportunity cost for 2 hours? It's playing video games. What's Steph's opportunity cost for those 2 hours? Probably signing some basketballs or some shoes and maybe filming a commercial. And during those same 2 hours, he might make $100,000. Should Steph give up $100,000 and mow the lawn? Well, of course not. The neighbor boy has the comparative advantage over Steph because his opportunity cost is lower. So now let's get back to our friends Frank and Rosie. Well, Rosie has an absolute advantage in meat and potatoes over Frank, but look at Frank's opportunity cost for potatoes. He has to give up only 8 ounces of meat to produce 32 ounces of potatoes. And Rosie would have to give up a lot more meat to produce those 32 ounces because she has a higher opportunity cost. So what we would say is it doesn't make sense for Rosie to spend her time producing potatoes as much as it is for Frank. So what would we suggest they do? Well, in a marketplace with trade, Frank should probably stop producing any meat at all. He does not have a comparative advantage in meat, but he does have a comparative advantage in potatoes. So we would say, hey, Frank, why don't you spend all of your time growing potatoes? Makes sense. But then he says, but I like meat. So how do I get my meat? And we say, no problem. You got Rosie right next door, and she has lots of meat, and she's really good at producing it. Trade her some of your potatoes for her meat. Okay. Now, what should Rosie be doing? Well, Rosie should be producing the optimal amount of meat and potatoes, considering the trade power of Frank. And what we see is Rosie should be producing 12 ounces of potatoes now and 18 ounces of meat instead of 12 and 24. That's because she's so good at producing the meat, and so she can do that and then trade some of her meat for the potatoes. And what we see is that, in fact, when they both do this, they generate more together of the meat and the potatoes with exactly the same resources. So using the same resources, nothing else, the comparative advantage and trade produces a higher quantity of goods and services for the same resources.